Record. Good evening, friends. Thank you for tuning in with us again as we pick up our study tonight in the book of Philippians in chapter 4. We got about halfway through last time, and we'll get a little deeper into things. Probably what you thought you were tuning in for last time is what we'll get to tonight. I doubt too many of our viewers and listeners out there thought that we were going to spend 40 minutes talking about helping out two women that had a disagreement. But I think if you listen to the study and what we went through, I thought it was good and vital and maybe some things you hadn't thought about before. So as we get in there tonight, as joining with me as always is my esteemed colleague, Mr. Ray. How's everything in Somerset tonight?
I don't know which I'm more offended by, esteemed or colleague. You don't want to spend 40 more minutes on Euodia? I think it's what the people are asking for.
So, I could call the distinguished gentleman from Somerset. The floor recognizes the distinguished gentleman from Somerset. As we kind of get into here, we're going to pick up at really 10. It's kind of where we were. We talked about as we ended last time, what to think on, things that are higher, nobler, to get your mind right, think on these things. It's interesting to remember, as we've said a bunch of times in this is a letter and it's one continuing building argument. So everything that he says has to do with the things that he just said before. So as he tells them they need to get themselves together and he asks the true brother to step in here and help them, get your mind right. And then he gets on to where they had concern for him. And I think, again, this is building on, we should have concern for one another. They shouldn't fight because they should love one another. We're driving back to unity. They had unity. And then Paul kind of spins this into, all things I've learned content. I've learned to be content. So that's my first question tonight for you, Michael. We'll let you fire at this. One, how exactly does one learn to be content? And then I'm going to push you a little bit on learning to be content with excess and learning to be content without. So how do you go about learning these things?
Yeah. That I did spend a little bit of time looking at that word content kind of in preparation for this conversation, because I think it is important. To your question, it's certainly that's a first world kind of problem, right? I mean, everybody's looking for contentment, not just first world, but I mean, I would say even in our modern world, that's the search for contentment is ongoing. But that word contentment is very similar Greek base to a word, autarky, a country that is completely self-sustained, that doesn't depend on any outside country in any way for any resources. This kind of imaginary utopian place where all the natural resources necessary for the inhabitants of the country are exist within the boundaries. And so that idea of autarky, I don't require anything from the outside to affect my contentment. That the things that are outside of in the world that could affect me positively or negatively are not going to alter my state of contentment, because my contentment is internal, right? I think those are obvious points, but I think that word kind of just to study that word, that understanding of that thought of autarky helped me to kind of see that from a different perspective and a little deeper. That it was the resources that Paul needed to be content were all internal. It's because Galatians 2:10, Christ lives in me. He had Jesus in him, and because of that, excess or need, those are outside factors. Physical excess, physical need are outside factors, and they weren't going to influence his, internal contentment.
So here's I want to follow real quick up with a question to that, though. When we talk about the contentment comes from within, yes. But to be content, does that necessarily mean that you still don't need others and aren't benefited by others?
Yeah, good question. I mean, so no question that others are important, right? That God put us in a church with with people to help us and support us for a reason. But I think that Paul has also learned that others will let you down. That others, as great as friends as we are, if my contentment is reliant on your actions, at some point I'm going to be let down and be discontent. And so do what?
100%.
Yeah. And I'd like to talk about some of those. But so there is, I think there has to be a difference in what others do bring to our life. They do bring edification. They do bring growth. They do bring happiness and joy, and they do bring fulfillment. But I don't think that they can bring contentment because ultimately that is relying on something outside of ourselves.
So that I think that's such a huge point here that we so often miss in this, is that our contentment comes from within, but it really ultimately comes from God through Jesus, right? That's where the source of contentment is. And I think if we look at every relationship we have that way, I shouldn't be a good friend to you because you're a good guy. I should be a good friend to you because Jesus was a good friend to me. I shouldn't be a good husband to my wife because she's good all the time, because from time to time, she's going to make mistakes from time to time, but if we say my contentment, my happiness, my joy, my reaction to everything is based on others, then I'm subject to the whims of the wind, right? But if I do what I do and I am who I am because of the one thing that is unchanging, and that's God through Christ Jesus, with what we have in the Holy Spirit, all of those things working together to make up what I need and what makes me whole, that allows me then to do that's what we got to base that on. I think that's important, but I want to back up just a little bit, because you went to content, and I think that's important, but how do you learn? Walk me through the learn part of this.
Well, I think that word learn is also a good candidate for word study, because my understanding of that word is that is an experiential learning, right? That some of what Paul learned here could not simply or only be learned academically or intellectually, that it had to be learned experientially. And so I think that Paul writes that way on purpose, that he did experience those things. He did experience people letting him down. You don't talk about Demas, you're going to talk about somebody else in that regard. He did experience highs and lows from a benevolent standpoint from those that were helping him. And so I think that's how he learned. He learned by not always getting it right, and which is a side point, but sometimes we read through the book of Acts and we think of Paul as Jesus, like he was sinless.
Right.
There's certainly Paul is to be admired, but he was not sinless. I think certainly he would admit, and we could probably find instances even in the book of Acts where he made mistakes. Mm-hmm. And so I think he learned to be content by sometimes not getting it right. I mean, I'm sure that there were times as Saul became Paul, and I mean that in kind of a evolution of his thinking kind of sense,
right?
That there were times that he was not content. He was, and probably in a way that we would admire, that he always thought he should have been doing more, that he was not content with his own growth. He wasn't content with his own preaching, so I think that's a very fine line, that he learned that from experience. And we talked in a previous class that in this book about that he was always reaching forward in his own life. And so I'm more interested in that contrast, right? And that how he is always, I'm trying to think of the phrase from the previous chapter, he was always striving, not that I have already achieved this or have already become perfect, but I'm always reaching forward, striving. So he does have some, we called it at the time, divine discontentment, that he knew that he was not made perfect, that he knew that he had not yet achieved this, that he knew that he still had more to do. But yet here he says he's learned in all things to be content. And so how do you square that circle?
Right. And I think there's several things here that are interesting, right? So when we get into, and we Philippians touches on this a little bit. It's more deeper in 2 Corinthians, right? When he's defending himself. He was a Pharisee of Pharisees, schooled at Gamaliel, circumcised on the 8th day, right? So when you go through that list, we don't comprehend what that means. Like, he was the guy. And one of the things that's interesting about guys that are that driven, and what you learn about is, and I don't know if you've caught, but some of this documentary they've been doing on Michael Jordan, like The Last Dance that season, right? I forgot how much of a jerk Michael Jordan was. Like, when you look back fondly, I was a kid. He was a basketball player. It was all cool. But you watch these interviews and the way he treated his teammates, the way he said it, looking back when he's telling his part of the story is, I wanted to do anything possible to win at all costs. So if I hurt your feelings, I don't care. I was trying to win. And those people, and it's not just Michael Jordan. If you read Steve Jobs' book and the things that he did as he was building Apple into the juggernaut that it is, that guy was way unbalanced, and staff hated him, and he ruined relationships and all that. So these guys that are the most successful are way unbalanced, right? And I think that because they can't be content in anything. They're always striving to the destruction even of everything else. So I think that's important. And to know that Paul, to be what he was when he's defending himself, was that unbalanced. Unequivocally, he was Steve Jobs, Michael Jordan, Bill Gates, unbalanced.
Saul.
Saul, right. I'm saying when he was schooled at Gamaliel, you don't get, it's
you're not taking letters to Damascus because of how cool and level-headed you are.
That's exactly right. And you're not sitting at Gamaliel's feet either. He's taking 1 or 2 students, and you better be sharper than everybody else to get there. So, we got an unbalanced guy here. And I think he's learning in that as he looks back on who that guy was to where he is now. All those things were rubbish. All those things in his life that he was so driven for, that was so important at the time, don't mean anything because now I've got Jesus and I understand better, broader. So I think that's part of this conversation when we talk about contentment. But I also think there's an amazing contrast between the end of chapter 3 and spiritual discontentment and chapter 4 when he's talking about physical contentment. Yes. I can be spiritually discontent whether I got 2 loaves of bread or no loaves of bread, right? I can still try to get better spiritually. But he's saying the physical circumstances, whether he's got a place to sleep or not, that's not going to change him spiritually. And I think that's amazing. I don't want to beat you up on these statistics, but you did this lesson not too long ago, but it may have been longer than I'm thinking. But anyway, where you looked at the survey of income inequality, and it was people, if you were making less than 50,000, how much would you need to be, better, to be content? How much would you need? Share, because I'm going to butcher it, from what you remember. Talk a little bit about that, because I think that was really cool.
Yeah, so rough numbers, and I'll try to post this on Facebook or a link to the study. But essentially, for the average American, the income number that they need, or they feel like they would need to be content and comfortable and well supplied, is roughly double what their current income level is for the average American. And what's fascinating about that is the guy that's 30,000, that means that there's a $30,000 gap between where he is and what his contentment level is, or what his perceived contentment level is. For the guy that's making 100,000, there's a $100,000 gap between where he is and where his perceived contentment level is. For the guy that's making $500,000, there's a $500,000 gap. And so, in dollar terms, the higher income level, the farther that these people are away from contentment. And that's the fascinating part. And that's the striving after the wind, right? That's as the preacher in Ecclesiastes would say. That the fascinating part about that is, as the world would define success, the more successful these people became, the farther they were from contentment. Yeah. And I don't think that that's an accident. And it's just, as you noted, some famous examples. I mean, there is nothing that is less revered in the business world than contentment. Mm-hmm. I mean, can you imagine like a CEO stepping out and giving an earnings release and saying, we're pretty happy where we are. If we could just maintain this level and just kind of stay here, I I think that we'd all be comfortable with our lives, and we wouldn't have to push too hard, and we can have nice balanced lives. And I think that this is the right size for us, and then we're just going to try to stay right here for the next decade. Oh, he'd be absolutely pilloried, right? I mean, so that contentment is there's the spiritual physical. I think you're spot on, and that's what I was trying to get at. And Paul, knowing that he wasn't where he needed to be spiritually, but he was perfectly cool with where he was physically, no matter what his state was. The world is not that way. The world will tell you that contentment is a sign of apathy. It's a sign of laziness.
Right.
And I think that this is a good lesson for anybody who has been fed too much of that, to come back and read the end of Philippians chapter 4. Paul's got a little different message.
Well, and I think the significant part of that is too that Paul said he had to learn with excess, right? When he was in the high tax bracket, right? When he was a 1%er, I had to learn to be content there. And then also when I was in abject poverty, when every city he shows up to, they're throwing boulders at him until he stops moving. When he's sneaking out under the wall, when he's going days or weeks without eating, he had to learn contentment there too. And I think depending on what side of the coin you are at any given time, it's, well, you just don't understand my situation. You've never walked in my shoes. It's whatever. We've got all kinds of reasons why we can't learn to be content. But I think that the important thing here is Paul, via the Holy Spirit, is hammering that this is a learned attribute. I don't care where you are socioeconomically. It is a learned attribute and a learned behavior. It is not innate. You're not just okay and content. You got to figure that stuff out.
And discontentment is there's nothing that'll make you a class warrior easier than discontentment, right? Is that, it must be easy at your income level to be content, or the other way, say, well, it must be easy if you don't have all the pressures of income and wealth that I've got. It's easy to be content. And so it makes class warriors out of us, because we're trying to deal with our own discontentment. And the opposite of that, just as you say, the opposite of that is where, those, if we get to the point where those ebbs and flows in our physical possessions don't have any impact on us, that would be contentment, right? That'd be autarky. Those outside influences doesn't affect the resources that we have that bring about our contentment.
Right. And I think that's what we've got to get to is, and so preview, Michael and I are kind of talking about the next section as we get to the end of Philippians is maybe doing a whole section on stewardship, which, you got a CPA and a financial planner talking about stewardship. So,
I mean, you hit my sweet tooth already on the income inequality thing. I mean, you just prime the pump there.
So I think we're going to get there. And this is a huge principle in stewardship, is that our lives, everything belongs to God. If I've got 2 nickels, they're both God's. If I've got $2 million, it's all God's too. That, we have to work and act and that, I think that's where contentment is that when we start to view our lives from a fiduciary capacity. And so what I mean by that, fiduciary power of attorney, that I'm using somebody else's goods, services, assets, and I'm using it to benefit them, not to benefit me, to benefit them, but out of my using it, there is some residual enjoyment I get out of that. So, again, this isn't the class to get into all of those concepts, but I think that's very important. If we want to get to contentment, then I've got to have a disownership of my physical assets. I've got to make sure I understand these aren't mine, so I can be content with whatever's in my hands.
And I definitely see that you see the flavor of that even later on in this chapter when Paul tells the Philippians, hey, I've received your gift, and we can get into that, into the weeds of that, what, when Epaphroditus brought whatever he brought from them, that Paul had received something monetarily from the Philippians. They had supported him even while he was in Rome. We say Rome in prison, but as we have said many times, when he's in house arrest in Rome, that they send him some money, and Paul's attitude toward that money is so fascinating in verse 17, not that I seek the gift. Again, I'm net Bible tonight, so I know I'm mixing it up on you, but not that I seek the gift, but I seek the credit that abounds to your account. So even in that comment, the resources that they sent, Paul said, yeah, I can use these. These are a useful tool for me in accomplishing what I want to accomplish. But I am so much happier that you got to experience the giving for what you can learn from the giving, that this resource that God gave you became a tool that you could learn from to give to me. And I'm happy that happened. And now I can use it in some other way, but this is not about you having less and me having more. To your point, it's about both of us utilizing this tool that's not ours to experience and learn to grow in our spiritual maturity and contentment. I think that attitude toward their gift speaks to exactly what you're talking about.
Yeah, and it's, it's always difficult to try to quantify this in words and phrases, at least in my mind. But, the way I think about it and the way I can keep it clean is, in essence, the money that they sent to Paul is essentially what allowed Paul to convert those in Nero's household, right? So they, via the gift, helped the conversion. And that's what Paul's saying. It's back to your account. We were able to help lost souls together. Yes, I was the mouthpiece, and I did the talking and the teaching and whatnot, but it was your gift that allowed me to do that, so you did the teaching in a transitive property kind of sense. And I think that's the amazing part when we talk about supporting the gospel. And when we, either as churches or as individuals, support gospel preachers doing the work in different places, that we are a part of that conversion. We are a part of the seed that they're sowing. We are a part of that. And that's why also it should never be a financial thing. And I don't want to get too bad on my soapbox here, but this is something I've always been passionate about, is if we support, either as a church, as a congregation, or as an individual, a preacher, the money is the small part of it. We should be praying for them. We should be encouraging them. Like, the Philippians didn't just wire Paul some money here and not care about how he was doing and care about the work and care about what was going on. The money was a small part of all of this transaction. The money was the least of the support that the Philippians gave the Apostle Paul in the work that he was doing. And I think that's very important.
Yeah, in fact, Paul said, "Hey, the money's great. I'm glad that you were able, for your benefit, to do that." In fact, I read this from the Contemporary English Version. I thought it was so interesting. In that version, it says, "I'm not trying to get something from you," verse 17, "but I want you to receive the blessings that come from giving." That's why he was glad to receive their gift, so that you could receive the blessings from giving. So anyway, I think completely agree. And we probably, to your point, we probably lose something in the modern way that we're familiar with supporting preachers in other areas, that not every gift, not every participation monetarily goes with a letter, right? So in Paul's day, every time the Philippians sent money, there was a letter every time. There was. And they sent that with Epaphroditus or with Luke or whoever went to see Paul, and then Paul would write a letter back. And so to your point, the monetary exchange was a part of the relationship that the Philippians had with Paul, but it was only a part. And that connection, that tie between the funds and the letter, how often that gets lost, right? Modern world's very has allowed us to wire the money very easily, and you get an update and a support letter, but those things aren't so tangibly tied together the way that they would have been in the first century.
Yeah, and I think the connections too, right? Does Paul's relationship with Epaphroditus get forged because he's the runner, right? And you're traveling, like, this stuff's not coming in the mail. Epaphroditus comes and brings his gift to Paul. Well, he's not turning around and going right back, right?
And got sick on the way, apparently.
He got sick on the way somewhere along the way. But I'm saying, even outside of this one incident, let's say Epaphroditus the time and again that he's carried this, he's not running and like, hey, Paul, here's your check. I'm going to get back on the road back to Philippi.
Yeah.
He probably spends days, weeks, months with Paul, and they grow their relationship. And then he goes back. And then, when Paul talks about Luke and Timothy and the greetings that he's going to talk about here at the end of that, that's part of it too, is Paul's sending things back to them and word back to them, and they're spending time with the group. And to your point, I think some of that stuff gets lost. We talked about this a little bit. I can't remember in the last lesson or lesson before, but as we're traveling, dropping in on other congregations, it's so huge. I think especially if you're supporting a preacher somewhere and your vacation, your travel, your business takes you in the vicinity of them, go hang out with them if you can. Because I know that would encourage me a lot if I was the preacher in that capacity. But I know when we've been able to spend time with those guys, it's been good for me as the visitor as much as the one being visited.
It makes such a difference when you see the name on the next financial report, right? I mean, it's too easy for those just become names. And I assure you that Paul wasn't just a name on the Philippians, cash flow statement, or whatever they put together. That is so critical. How do we think that Paul? How do we think that Paul knew about the two ladies that he talked about in the first part of Philippians chapter 4, right? Because he was having long and meaningful discussions with Epaphroditus. That's my guess. Is that every time that somebody came from Philippi, wouldn't you love to be in that room? That they sit down and talk for hours about, hey, who you got new in Philippi? Have you got any new folks that are coming to have joined the number? What about the jailer? What about Lydia? How they doing? How's Lydia's family? What's new with her? She's been, how could Paul have written so eloquently about all the people that he wrote about in the end of the book of Romans to a place he'd never been? He had long, intense conversations about some of those souls and people that he genuinely had never met, and yet you can tell he knew them.
Yeah.
So that relationship, that is a true participation. That's a true fellowship in the work somewhere else.
And we skipped this, but I got to circle back because it's significant here. Maybe, or arguably anyway, the most misused verse that I've ever heard quoted is Philippians 4:13, right?
Yeah.
But in context, so not because I'm trying to win a Super Bowl or hit a home run, but in context, what in the world does Philippians 4:13 mean in context? Yeah. And how does it actually help? Where's the strength come from? What form does the strength come in? Make that make sense to me, because I keep hearing people write it on baseballs and stuff like that.
Yeah. Well, I think that we do a disservice to the text if we divorce it from verses 11 and 12. And those are the verses we just talked about. And we talked about Paul learned contentment in any situation. So to put that into your example, he learned to be content whether he hit the home run or whether he struck out. And that and being able, I can do all things. I have the strength to face anything because of Christ who strengthens me. That being able to do all things is, I believe that's the part that's misused. The ability to be content in all things. If I'm handling that correctly, and that is tied to verses 11 and 12, the ability to be content in all things through Christ who strengthens me. Now that means something. And that I think is a more fair way to view that verse. I do think that there's some value in understanding that we can better experience things in this life, and we can handle things better in this life because of Jesus. But it better be the good things and the bad things. And so if that's what we mean, I did this because Jesus is with me in either situation, then I think we're closer to the intent of that verse.
Yeah, I've just never heard somebody quote that after going 0 for 4. I just that's not typically when that verse gets brought up.
It never comes out of the losing locker room, right?
Right. And nobody else says, "Hey, boys, we can get through this because of Jesus."
But I think if we're being honest, that's how it would be used accurately, right? I mean, right. Is that the way you would handle that verse?
And more so, right? I mean, I would think, to a certain degree, more so dealing with understanding disappointment and understanding difficulties and getting through trials more so than success, right? It's back to the wise man, what Solomon said in Ecclesiastes chapter 7. It's better to go to the house of mourning than to the house of feasting, because the house of mourning is a house of higher education. So when he's talking about that, it's hard things. Going to the house of mourning, loss, difficulties, tragedy, that's hard. Everybody can go to the party. Like on the winning team, everybody's happy, everybody's excited. It's hard to go to the funeral home, right?
Yeah.
It's hard to swing by there and deal with those difficult circumstances.
And just, if you step back a moment, and as you said, you look at the way that verse is typically used, or popularly used. I can do all things that Christ who strengthens me. The goal of the things that are being done, and most of those goals are personal, ego-driven, earthly targets. There's some measure of success that is not spiritual. Right. And if we think that that's what Paul had in mind, I mean, that's an insult to what Paul wrote in the whole rest of this book. To think that Paul wrote about all the things he wrote about, and all the things that we've studied over these last few weeks, and then he gets to here and he says, "But I'm going to meet all of my personal goals because of what Jesus is doing through me." That's not even close to meshing. And so, to make that make sense, you got to say, I can be what Jesus wants me to be. Contentment, verses 11 and 12. I can maintain my spirituality, even though I'm still striving. I haven't achieved perfection. Certainly, I can be content no matter the circumstance. I can do all of that because of Jesus is within me, and I can achieve His goals for me because of So as long as you understand what all things are, right. and what all things would mean, be important to Paul, and I think you can handle that verse more accurately.
And that you hit on something there that is just mission critical here. The goals and the all things are kingdom things, not might things, not individual ego. It's, I can still be a Christian and a spiritual leader, and I can still develop whether we won the Super Bowl or lost the Super Bowl, right? I can do kingdom things. It's not about physical. It's not about what's important to this world. It's not about any of those things, because all those things are really detractors and fighting against the kingdom. It's, what am I doing to further God's cause? That's where the strength comes in. And that's exactly what Paul's talking about here is, if I'm on house arrest and I don't have any money to pay for this house that I'm arrested to, right? But I'm okay, because I'm still doing spiritual things. Whoever's locked up to me every day is getting a Bible lesson, right? Whoever I can come in contact with, I'm still furthering the cause of Jesus, whether I'm broke or whether I'm in excess. None of that matters. Boys, here's what's important. And I think in a lot of ways, this is a refocusing. So to go all the way full circle is, this is so important to the two ladies that are bickering, right? Is that, look, we can do all things through Jesus. We can accomplish kingdom goals. We can be unified. We can do what we need to do if we'll put all this stuff together, right? If we can do all of this at the same time, we can get to the goals that we need to accomplish. It's not about you. It's not about me. It's about Jesus. It's about God. It's about the kingdom. It's about what we can do for the good of Christ. And that's what's got to be important.
No question. Whose kingdom do we think Paul was building, and whose goals do we think? So,
you may have come unplugged or something. Your audio just went goofy.
Really?
There you go. You're better now. I don't know if like you hit your audio plug or something, but
sorry about that.
A little strange. So
we'll check your editing. Check your editing skills.
That's suspect at best. So Paul here, to kind of come back, he's kingdom building. We're working on getting better. We're working on doing things. And as he transitions even from 13, he talks about, yet it was kind of you to share my trouble And you Philippians yourselves know that in the beginning of the gospel, when I left Macedonia, no church entered into partnership with me in giving and receiving except you only. Even in Thessalonica, you sent me help for my needs once and again. Not that I seek the gift, but the fruit to increase to your credit. I've received full payment and more. I am well supplied, having received from Epaphroditus the gifts you sent, a fragrant offering, a sacrifice acceptable and pleasing to God. And my God will supply every need of yours according to his riches and glory in Christ Jesus. To our God and Father be glory forever and ever. Amen. So I think it's significant too, as Paul points that back. So to kind of go back, we skipped around a little bit here, but to go back here, what's God supplying? God's not going to make it rain and send helicopter money to Philippi. That's not the point here. But it's supplying these other needs that Paul's writing to, right? It's the joy. It's the rejoice always. And again, I say rejoice. It's all of these biblical, spiritual, Galatians 5, fruit of the Spirit. That's what God's going to supply to the Philippians, because that's desperately what they need. That's what's going to help them grow.
Yeah, it just strikes me as we read this, and even as you read that, we very quickly said first mistaking Jesus because they were looking for a physical Messiah, right? They wanted somebody to rebuild the physical kingdom, and yet we read passages like Philippians 4 and verse 13 and in verse 19, and we turn all things into baseball games and business success. It's the exact it's the modern equivalent of that issue of trying to turn Jesus into some measure of physical success and making his impact in our lives. I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. Now watch me go hit this sales goal. That is, I just think that the similarities there are pretty striking.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. Again, depending on where you're at, Bible study wise, history wise, and we don't have time to go into all the background of this, but essentially the reason why the Pharisees and the Sadducees and the whole Sanhedrin hated Jesus was because he wasn't what we try to turn him into, right? If Jesus came in, on a horse and he was going to overthrow Rome, like they're all behind him. He never gets crucified. If he was
questions.
The king that was prophesied about, they're all in. But he was the suffering servant, and they didn't like that guy. That wasn't who they were looking for. They're looking for David, not the suffering servant.
Can you imagine he rolls his sleeves up and walks in and said, "Here, boys, we can do all things because of me." They're all in on that. That's exactly what they want. That's John 6, right? He feeds them feeds the multitudes out of loaves and fish, and they're ready to make him king. Because we don't have to worry about Rome anymore. We got somebody who can provide provisions. We'll just take over, right? We can do all things through this guy. The parallels are striking.
Yeah, and the Pharisees and Sadducees would have been peppering Jesus about those 12 legions. So you mentioned those 12 legions of angels. How exactly does that work? Can we sit here and just send them to Rome and then they come back? Like, how would we do that? It's foolishness. But it was the suffering, it was the compassion, it was all the things that they didn't want to see. And again, like as bad as I look back with my 2020 Monday morning quarterback vision, right, and say, you idiots. But if you're honestly reading the Old Testament, you see two different people, right? You see the triumphant king and the suffering servant. I mean, if I try to put myself, if I'm a Jew in first century, I'm probably looking for two guys too. Maybe I'm trained enough in the scriptures that I recognize Jesus as the suffering servant, but I'm going to have a hard time making him the triumphant king too. Like I get that piece of it.
Sure.
But we've got to be very careful that we don't go back and try to change that Rubik's Cube too.
Yeah. And it's very easy to do that in our own modern way, right? Is that we appreciate the fact that Jesus was the suffering servant, but for me, I'm going to do all things because, so I think it's very easy to fall into that mindset. And, as we've talked about, even throughout this book, it's a book about joy, but it's also a book about suffering. And Paul has brought that up several times. So there's a connection there between doing all things through Christ and suffering. And so that all things is being able to be content in that environment.
And it's amazing as he kind of puts a bow on this, and 21 through 23. These are verses again. I'll raise my hand. I'm the guy that read those way too fast most of my life and didn't hear what he was saying there. But I just want you to listen. Greet every saint in Christ Jesus. The brothers who are with me greet you. All the saints greet you, especially those of Caesar's household. The grace of Lord Jesus be with you and your spirit. So what you think about that? So he's on house arrest, but he's got some brothers with him. Where'd those brothers come from? He's converted them, right? He's done work, right? And not only that, but these guys that are in Caesar's household, and who's Caesar at this time again? Michael, refresh the audience.
I believe that would have been Nero Caesar.
So, and see, these guys that are in Nero's household greet you. And especially they do. Why? Because of what he just said. Because without what you were doing in the sharing of the work of the gospel, those brothers, the ones here in the house and the ones next door at Caesar's, they never meet Jesus without you. And man, that's huge.
Yeah, I just, again, don't know what the Philippians would have known already about that scenario. But if it is possible that they were not aware that there were Christians in Caesar's household, and Paul closes this letter that way, thank you for your participation in this. By the way, your brethren in Caesar's household greet you especially. I mean, just, it probably started a riot when that was read. Can you imagine Paul got into Caesar's household with the gospel? I mean, that the power, the electricity of that moment when that is realized in Philippi. I mean, that's a moment.
So conjecture, right? So let's be very clear about this conjecture. But for a colony that wanted to be Rome, that their architecture of the roads coming in, they did everything to look like Rome.
Yes.
It was built in their citizenry and their culture and everything they are. They want to be Rome. We got brothers in Caesar's household. We got sisters in Caesar's household.
Yeah.
I mean, how does that from a nationalism not burn through their veins?
Yeah.
Right? When not only just the power and the spread and the reach of the gospel, but how they must feel, we, this colony, we who want to be like Rome are influencing Rome.
Yes.
I mean, it's unbelievable.
And the other part of that, because of where they were, these guys, their religion was a minority in Philippi. And in many ways, it was disparaged in Philippi, for sure. And they are trying to be what Jesus wants them to be, and said, we know that our citizenship in heaven is looked down upon as a citizen of Rome. And to live with that and to feel like a second, again, I don't want to take this too far, but to feel like a second-class Roman citizen because of their citizenship in heaven, which is how they would have been looked on by many of the Roman citizen brethren in Philippi, and to know that we've got brethren in Caesar's household, that we've got brethren in Rome, that they are fighting the battle too, and they've probably got it worse than we do because they're at ground zero in Rome. Again, the sense of brotherhood and unity and shared courage and faith because of that is it's pretty heavy.
So remember, if you weren't here for the intro lesson 1, remember the primary religion in Philippi, the primary religion in Rome is a theocracy. They believe Caesar is both King, Caesar, and God all in one. Okay, so the best analogy I can use for people with a sense of history is that would be like Paul saying, I've converted some of the Greek gods, right? Here I am on Mount Olympus, and I've converted some of the God's household. It's that level of we've gotten that far in, and not that they needed validation or vindication or anything for their beliefs. Please don't misunderstand what I'm saying here. But when you're kicked in the teeth every day and told your religion's fake, you're defying Caesar, you guys are way off the reservation, when that's what you're being told, and that's the type of persecution you're facing on top of the physical stuff. I'm just saying from a emotional level, there is a level of vindication to know that the gospel spreads in Caesar's house just as well as it does in Philippi. And how much do you redouble your efforts of evangelism? If Paul can convert people that are, living next to Nero, living in Nero's household, how much can I go get this guy that's down the street from me?
Yeah, and I think what you're talking about is a lot of what the book of Acts is about. The book of Acts, first time through, it's a book about Peter and Paul. As you continue to read, it's a book about dozens of people who took that gospel fire and changed the world. It's about the way the Philippians felt when they knew that they had brethren in Rome, and then what they did in Philippi. It's about people like Epaphroditus and Epaphras and people like Luke and the hundreds and hundreds that names are never recorded, that understood how important it was that there was a Christian in Caesar's household. And as you said, took that edification, that being built up from that knowledge, and took it down the street to Philippi. I mean, that's what changed the world. It wasn't, I mean, Paul, absent those people, is a great preacher, but he never changes the world. It's his influence on others that go spark those fires in other places that makes Christianity, in a relatively short amount of time, the greatest movement the world's ever known.
Yeah, the amazing thing when you read through, and these little nuggets, I want to call them here, are everywhere throughout the New Testament. As you read them, they're verses we read too fast, we don't pay enough attention to, we don't sit and think about what the implications are. But these verses and these other greet this one, greet that one at the end of these chapters, when the Hebrew writer in Hebrews chapter 11, in that honor roll of the faithful, you get through everybody we know, right? And then you get to the point where he says, and some were sawn into and quartered, names that the world is not worthy enough to know about. That's who these people are. That's exactly who these people are. They are people that took and spread the gospel. And these people still exist. These people are in Somerset and in Lexington and in Cincinnati and in New York spreading the gospel. I mean, these people exist today, and they're doing incredible, extraordinary things at the hands of ordinary people. And that's what makes the gospel amazing, is it's not about the person. It's not about the carrier. It's about the message. It's the carriers, as Jesus put it, as Paul, reinforced in Corinthians, we're just sowing in water. And I mean, it's, you almost can't screw it up, right? If you're sowing and you're watering, it's God giving the increase. We understand that my job is to sow and my job is to water. And as long as I do that, all the rest of this stuff will take care of itself. But when I hear about this, and when I have the opportunity to hear about works going on in different places and the great things that they're doing, how much more, I hear about the guys that are working in New York or working in, LA or working in these, pretty tough environments. If they're converting souls there, well, what can I do here? I mean, I should redouble my efforts too. And I think that's the encouragement that keeps relighting and reigniting my fires to continue to do good. And I can see that here too.
Yeah, I think that's succinctly why, one of the reasons Paul wrote this letter. I mean, for them to rekindle that fire, to know that joy, to understand his contentment, and to get fired up about, we got a Christian in Caesar's household. Let's get after this.
Mm-hmm.
I got a feeling that's how they would have left the book.
Yeah.
The letter.
Yeah, I think so. I think there's a lot there. So that's it. We're out of text.
And time.
We're always out of. That's not new. The verses thing, we're new. So we are, I think, especially the way we ended this, I think we're going to regroup and make a run at stewardship starting next week, and throw some lessons out there for you all. I did a series of meetings at Lakeside and a couple other places on stewardship. Michael's done a couple classes on stewardship, but I think this is good. For nothing else, I mean, you're going to get stewardship from the perspective of a CPA and a CFP that's going to look at it from, really a financial standpoint of what it means and can help you through some stuff. We'll try to do some nuts and bolts pieces of this too, things you can do specifically to be better as part of this study, as well as the concepts. So that's one of the things that I know both Michael and I, as we put our class material and meeting material together, we always wanted to do is not, hey, here's a concept, but you can't do anything with it. But we'll try to give you some tools and things to work through this. If you want to join in with us, we'll start posting these next week. But thank you all for staying along with the ride so far. I think we've got a couple more weeks before this present distress gets lifted. The 20th is what the governor of the great Commonwealth of Kentucky said. But if we still got people that want to look at us, we'll keep posting lessons, and to God be the glory.
Yeah. If COVID brought us together, I think we should stay together.
That's right. Although you probably should go outside if you can and get some air. Thank you all again so much for tuning in. Thank you, Michael, for the study, and we'll get to work on the next one.
Yeah, man. Love you, brother.